On the morning of June 14th, 1929, two teenage boys walked through an open field outside of Columbus, Ohio. Suddenly, the boys stopped because up ahead they saw a huge swarm of black flies hovering over the tall grass. The boys couldn't see what was below the swarm, so they slowly walked a bit closer to get a better look. When they finally got close enough to see what was on the ground, both boys instantly turned around and began screaming for help. When the police finally arrived, they too were horrified by what they saw in that field. But, as gruesome as it was, it did seem like a pretty straightforward crime of passion. However, their investigation would quickly take a totally bizarre turn that would involve rare recreational drugs, hidden bank accounts, secret lovers, secret apartments, and an Olympic gold medalist. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please swap out the white noise machine in the Amazon Music Follow Button's bedroom for a speaker blasting bedtime stories. A brand new podcast from Ballen Studios and my favorite new show. Just search for Ballen Studios and then look for bedtime stories on Amazon Music. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a February evening in 1928, 23-year-old medical student Thera Hicks looked out from the passenger seat of her date's car and watched downtown Columbus, Ohio, pass by. Thera was pale and pretty, with cropped brown hair. She had on a fitted dress and wore her father's old watch on her wrist. She was wearing a dress that night to go out, but Thera often wore pants, dress shirts, and ties, a fashion trend that some women had embraced in the 1920s to show that certain types of clothes were not just for men. Thera's date turned his car onto a rural road that led out of the city, and Thera watched the buildings of Columbus give way to open fields and farmland. She turned to her date and smiled, and he smiled back. Thera's date that night was a man named Marion Myers. He was significantly older than Thera, almost 35 years old at the time, and he was tall, skinny, and bald. Thera and Marion had met on campus at Ohio State University. Thera went to medical school there, and Marion worked in the university's agricultural department. They had been seeing each other off and on for over a year, but only Thera's closest friends even knew Marion existed, because Thera did not talk much about her personal life. Her best friends knew that Thera occasionally went on dates with Marion, but they thought she never took any of those dates too seriously. And unlike most of her friends, Thera never talked about wanting to meet the right guy or getting married. In fact, some of Thera's friends had started to wonder if she even liked men at all, and they thought maybe seeing Marion was just a way for her to cover up the fact that she was actually interested in women. But her friends could never be sure, because when Thera talked to them about her life, she almost always focused on her dream of becoming a doctor, or on the social changes she wanted to fight for that would give women more rights in a society that was still heavily dominated by men. Her friends loved that Thera was passionate about important subjects, but most of them still thought the way she lived her life was kind of strange. Even the fact that Thera was going to medical school seemed totally out of the ordinary to them, because in the late 1920s, women made up less than 5% of all medical students in the United States. In the car, Marion asked Thera how school was going, and she smiled again. One of the reasons she liked spending time with Marion was that he believed she had as much right to be in medical school and to become a doctor as any man did. Thera said school was going well and that she was really busy with classes and work, but she didn't mind. Thera had worked hard in school her entire life, and she continued to work hard at medical school to achieve her goal of becoming a doctor. And so far, her commitment had paid off. While in school, Thera had spent time working in the veterinary department at Ohio State alongside one of the most respected veterinarians in the country, Dr. James Snook, who invented a revolutionary technique for spaying cats and dogs. And soon Thera was going to start working at the campus hospital. Thera believed that any work experience in a medical facility would help her in the future when she was looking for a job. And she thought that having connections like Dr. Snook would lend her credibility in a profession that a lot of people thought women had no business pursuing. Marion pulled his car onto a dirt road that was almost hidden by the fields that surrounded them on both sides. The road was bumpy and the car shook a little. Thea laughed as she got tossed back and forth in the passenger seat, and then she saw their destination ahead of them. They were going to a shooting range, kind of in the middle of nowhere, a few miles outside of Columbus. The place was popular with amateur marksmen and hunters in the area, but Thea and Marion were not going there to shoot guns. The location of the shooting range and the fact that it blocked the view of people driving by on the main road had made the open field near the range a popular spot for couples to go to have sex. The range had become so well known for this that people in Columbus had nicknamed it Shirt Tail Alley. Marion drove his car past the shooting range and a little way into the open field and parked. Thea leaned across the seat and kissed him, and then Thea slipped off her dress. Marion took off his clothes, and they climbed into the cramped back seat together. But just a few minutes later, they heard someone pounding on the car door. Thea and Marion froze. Then they heard a policeman telling them both to get out of the car. Thea looked at Marion and she almost started laughing. She reached into the front seat and she grabbed her dress. Outside, the policeman stepped away from the car, turned his back, and allowed Thea and Marion to step outside and put their clothes back on. Then, after they were dressed, the officer issued them both a ticket for the crime of fornication, which was defined at the time as sexual intercourse between two unmarried people. And the officer told them they would each have to pay a $20 fine, which would have been over $350 in 2023. The policeman told Marion and Thea to go home, and then he got into his car and waited for them to leave. Thea and Marion climbed back into Marion's car, and right away, Marion apologized for putting Thea in that situation. Thea said she wasn't angry and she wasn't ashamed or embarrassed. She believed part of achieving greater rights for women was getting rid of the judgment and ridicule that young women her age often endured when they had sex before they were married. But Thea was not naive. She knew that a lot of people still frowned on things like premarital sex, so much that it was technically against the law where she lived. And even though Thea did not agree with that law, she didn't want more incidents like the one she had just had to adversely affect her future. Thea knew the odds were stacked against her when it came to having a successful career as a doctor, so she didn't want to make her dream any harder to achieve than it already was, and she didn't want to give anybody an excuse not to take her seriously at med school. So, in the months after she got caught with Marion, Thea talked even less about her personal life with her friends, and her friends noticed that Thea didn't go on dates at all anymore. Even when Thea went to parties with her friends and their boyfriends, she never brought a guy with her. But Thea's friends didn't worry about her because she seemed happy and she seemed even more focused on medical school and her future. And by the beginning of 1929, a few months after Thea turned 24, she felt like her dream of becoming a doctor was actually within her reach. Her classes were still going well. She was training for a new position at the hospital on the Ohio State campus. And there was a chance that she was going to get to help Dr. James Snook, the respected veterinarian she had worked with, on a book he was writing. And so even a lot of Thea's friends and family who had wondered why she had gone to medical school in the first place started to believe that Thea was close to achieving her dreams. At about 7 p.m. on June 13th, 1929, over a year after the fornication incident at the shooting range, Thea stood in her small bedroom in her apartment in Columbus, Ohio. She was reading a letter, and she felt her heart beat a little faster. The letter started off, "My dearie, I awakened early at about 7 and of course thought of you at once." Thea read about how much the person who had written the letter couldn't wait to see her again. And Thea smiled at the writer's signature at the bottom of the page. In big letters, it just said Janet. Thea put the letter from Janet back into one of the drawers in her desk, and she got even more excited about her plans that night. Then, Thea looked in the mirror to check her makeup and clothes. She was wearing a sleeveless brown dress with a white collar and a rhinestone belt, and she had her father's old watch on her wrist, like she always did. Thea grabbed her purse, stepped out of her bedroom, and saw her and a roommate sitting in the living room of their apartment. The two young women saw Thea, and a look of shock came across both their faces. They couldn't remember the last time Thea had gotten dressed up to go out on a date, but they were sure that's what she was doing. Thea told them she was going out with somebody that night, but she didn't say who was a who. Then, she told her roommates she would see them when she got home, and she went outside. She walked down to the end of the street and hailed a cab to take her to the Ohio State campus. On the Dr. Thea asked the cab driver if she could have one of their cigarettes because Thea was nervous and she thought maybe it would calm her down. The driver reached into his pocket, pulled out a pack, and handed her a cigarette and matches. Thea lit the cigarette but only took 2 puffs before she put it out, and she still felt nervous and excited. When Thea got to Ohio State, the sun was just setting and she thought the campus looked like it was glowing. She walked down a tree-lined sidewalk towards the parking lot by the student center, and she saw a blue model of Ford coupe parked in the lot. That was Janet Scar. Thea looked around to make sure nobody was watching her, and then she walked quickly to the blue coupe. She hopped into the passenger seat, leaned over and gave Janet a kiss, and soon after the car pulled out of the parking lot and headed out of Columbus. At 10:00 a.m. on Thursday, June 14th, so the morning after Thea had met Janet on campus, 2 teenage boys stepped out of a car and walked through the high grass in an open field near the shooting range outside of Columbus. The boys both loved shooting rifles at the range, and that morning they had decided to have a contest to see who was the better shot. As they walked through the field, the boys laughed and talked, and each of them boasted about how they were going to win the competition. But then one of the boys stopped and stared a few feet ahead of them into the field. His friends stopped behind him to ask what was going on. The boy pointed his finger to where a swarm of flies were buzzing around something on the ground that was hidden by the tall grass. Both of the boys squinted to get a better look, and they wondered if maybe there was a dead animal that was attracting all the flies, so they walked a bit closer, the sound of the flies getting louder and louder as they approached. Then the boys both stopped again because they thought they saw a pile of women's clothes on the ground. The boys looked at each other and laughed. They knew the reason couples came to this field by the shooting range, so they figured, maybe a woman who was here with her date had been forced to run off without her clothes because the cops had shown up. But the boys were quickly more interested in the swarm of flies and whatever was below them, and so they took a few more steps forward. And when they got close enough to actually see what was on the ground, well, they both started screaming for help. Pretty soon, the farmer who owned the land and who had been working nearby ran over to the boys. The farmer looked down at the ground where all the flies were swarming, and he told the boys to go get the police. The boys turned around and ran back through the field to their car. They got in and drove a few minutes down the main road to the small local police station. They ran inside and told the first cop they saw what they had found in the field. 2 police officers ran out of the station, got into their car, and drove to the field where the boys had just come from. About an hour later, Detective Otto Phillips of the Columbus Police sat at his desk going over some notes on a case he was working. Phillips's phone rang and he answered it. A police officer from a small department outside of the city was on the line. He told Phillips that a body had been discovered in a field near the shooting range, and the local police needed help. Phillips hung up the phone and put away his notes from the other case. He figured the case wasn't nearly as important as a dead body that was just found in a field. Phillips stood up, put on his jacket, grabbed his fedora hat, and headed out of the station. He drove a few miles outside of Columbus and saw several cars parked on the side of the road next to the open field by the shooting range. Phillips got out of his car and walked towards the small group of men that had already gathered in the field. Phillips saw there were 2 cops from the nearby station, the county coroner, and a police photographer. Phillips knew the coroner well, but he introduced himself to the others and then asked if they would all clear some space for him. All the men moved back, and Phillips took a few steps forward. And right away, the sound of the flies buzzing and the smell hit him first. And then, when he crouched down, he saw the body of a young woman. Phillips took off his hat and tried to swat the flies away. Then he leaned in closer to the body. The victim was lying on her left side, and her face was on the ground. Her right arm was stretched out in front of her, and it was very badly bruised. Phillips knew this shooting range was like a lover's lane for young couples. So, his first thought was that this crime scene could be the horrible result of an argument that this poor girl had had with her boyfriend. Phillips stood up and called the coroner and the other officers back over. The other officers said they had not located a weapon of any kind in the area, and they also said they had not yet found any identification of any kind on or near the victim. The coroner pointed out to Phillips that the victim's watch had stopped at 9:58. He thought that was probably close to the time that she had been killed the night before. The victim's head, face, and neck were covered in blood, and so the coroner said he would run some blood tests when they did the autopsy. But in police investigations in 1929, blood tests were basically only used to determine two things: if the blood belonged to a human or an animal, and what the blood type was if it was found to be human blood. But a lot of people share the same blood type, so Phillips knew a blood test could not identify a specific person. So as Phillips stood there in the middle of the field, he had no idea who he was looking at, and the test the coroner was going to run would not make that any clearer. But Phillips had to figure out who this young woman was before he could even start thinking about who might have killed her. The news of the body found outside the city did not take long to spread, and that afternoon two of Columbus's newspapers ran salacious headlines about the dead girl found at the infamous Lover's Lane nicknamed Shirt Tail Alley. Normally, Detective Phillips hated those kinds of headlines, and he couldn't stand that newspapers often put wild theories in their articles before anything was even known about a case. But that afternoon, Phillips thought the attention-grabbing newspaper stories might actually help him figure out who the murder victim was. And Phillips would be right. Not long after the newspapers went out that day, two young women arrived at the Columbus police station. They said they had seen the articles about the body found in the field, and they were worried it was their roommate because she had gone out the night before but never came home. Phillips thanked the women for coming in. Then he asked them if they would go with him and another officer to the mortuary where the body had been taken to see if they could identify the victim. And the women agreed to go. So the women took a short drive with Phillips and the other police officer. Then they walked into a cold, quiet room in the mortuary. The officers led them to a table to see the body, and the women stood there in shock. They hugged each other and started crying. The victim's face was mangled and bloody, but they could still see it was their roommate, Thera Hicks. Phillips said he was sorry to put the women on the spot when he knew how upset they were. But based on where police had found Thera's body, his instinct was that whoever had killed her was most likely a man she was seeing. So Phillips asked if they knew who that man might be. The women talked to each other for a second, and then one of them told Phillips that they knew Thera had gone out on a date the night before, but that she was very private about her personal life and almost never talked about who she was actually seeing. But the woman said there was one guy who Thera had always seemed to go back to in the past, and that was an older man named Marion Myers. Phillips thanked the woman again for all their help, and then he and the other officer took them back to the station. Later that night, Phillips began looking into Marion's background, and it didn't take long for him to think this guy was the perfect suspect. Phillips learned from the officers at the small department outside of Columbus that, a year earlier, Marion had paid a fine after he had been busted for fornication. Phillips also learned that Thera had been in the car with Marion when police found him, and that the incident had taken place in the same field where the teenage boys had discovered Thera's body. Early the next morning, so June 15th, the county coroner was sitting in a small office at the mortuary putting together notes from Thera's autopsy. Then he heard footsteps outside the office. The coroner put down his pen, got up from his desk, and walked out of his office. And he got startled when he saw a tall, skinny, bald man pacing back and forth. The coroner asked why the man was there, and the man looked at the coroner and said he wanted information about the dead girl police had found at the shooting range. The coroner asked who the man was and why he thought it was okay for him to be there. But the man just kept pacing and asking about the dead girl. So the coroner just turned and rushed back into his office and called the Columbus police to tell them what was going on. But by the time the coroner hung up and walked back out of the office, the tall, skinny, bald man had already disappeared. But when the coroner described this man to the police, they were certain it was Marion, and Detective Phillips was already planning to bring Marion into the station that day. Not long after the call from the coroner, Phillips sent officers to the house where Marion lived on the Ohio State campus to get him and bring him in for questioning. The police found Marion at the house and quickly drove him to the station. Marion was already Phillips's prime suspect, and his bizarre behavior at the mortuary just made him seem even guiltier to Phillips. Phillips led Marion into a small interrogation room. It was a cool day and it had been raining, but Marion looked hot and sweaty. Phillips asked Marion about his relationship with Thera. Marion said they had dated on and off for a couple of years, but they were not dating anymore. Marion said he loved Thera, but she did not love him, and he was sure that she was seeing someone else even when they were together. Phillips asked Marion where he had been on the night of Thera's murder. Marion said he had nothing to do with what happened to Thera. Then he proceeded to stumble through a story about everything he had done on the day of the murder to prove that he had an alibi. Phillips felt like, during his time as a detective, he'd learned how to read people pretty well, but there was something about Marion that he just couldn't quite figure out. Marion came off as a jealous, jilted lover, and there was a chance that he was making up his supposed alibi on the spot. But Phillips also got the sense that this was the kind of guy who would go into a panic and start rambling even when he was asked a simple question, like what he had eaten for dinner the night before. So by the end of the interview, Phillips still considered Marion a major suspect, but he wanted to know if Marion was right about Thera seeing someone else. Because if Thera was dating someone else and that was who she had gone out with the night she got murdered, Phillips needed to find out. Later that morning, Phillips and other members of the investigative team went to Thera's apartment, and her roommates showed them to her bedroom. At first glance, Phillips thought it looked like the typical bedroom of a young, single woman. But when he opened one of the drawers of a small wooden desk, Phillips started to think there might not be anything typical about Thera at all. In the desk drawer, Phillips found an Derringer, a small handgun that was easy to conceal. Next to the gun, Phillips found a couple of bank passbooks, which were savings account logs that people kept in the 1920s. And when Phillips looked at those passbooks, he was stunned. Thera had at least two savings accounts with almost $2,500 between them. For reference at the time, that was more than the average American family made in a year. Also, $2,500 then would have been equal to about $45,000 today in 2023. Phillips had talked to Thera's roommates and a few of her other friends after her body had been identified, and they had all said that Thera worked on campus just to make enough money to get by medical school. So Phillips was surprised that she had thousands of dollars in savings, and he started to wonder if Thera had been living some kind of a double life. Then Phillips opened another desk drawer and he found something that immediately backed up that double life theory. Phillips pulled out a stack of letters that had been written to Thera, and they were all from someone named Janet. And once Phillips had read through the letters, it seemed clear to him that Thera and Janet had been in a various romantic relationship. So Phillips needed to find out if Janet was the person Thera had gone out with on the night of her murder. But Phillips didn't have a last name for Janet, and when he asked Thera's roommates about Janet, they said they had no idea who Janet was, and it was. A few hours later, Phillips and his team met with Thera's classmates and people who she worked with at the campus hospital, but nobody they talked to knew anyone named Janet. And so the police went down their list of other people to talk to, and they saw there was a guy named Dr. James Snook, who Thera had worked with in the veterinary department. And so they contacted James and they asked him if he'd be willing to come to the police station and answer some questions about Thera. And James said fine. He came down to the station and he sat down with Phillips and the other members of the investigative team. Phillips immediately thought James looked and talked exactly like a typical professor. He was 49 years old. He wore a nice suit and glasses, and whenever he talked, it sounded like he was explaining things to a big group of college kids. James told the police that Thera had once worked in the veterinary department in the steno pool, which meant she took notes in shorthand in meetings and at lectures. And James said Thera had been great at her job. And so he thought she might be able to help him while he compiled stories for a book he wanted to write. Phillips asked what the book was about, and James got a little embarrassed and said he was working on a book about himself because not only had he been a pioneer in veterinary science and medicine, but also he'd won a gold medal at the 1920 Olympics in Belgium. Once that information came out, immediately the officers started asking James questions about what it was like to compete in the Olympic Games and what it felt like to win gold against amazing athletes from all around the world. But eventually, Phillips got the conversation back on track and he asked if James knew of anyone named Janet who worked in his department at the university, or who might be connected to the veterinary school in some way. James thought about it for a minute but said nobody came to mind. But he admitted that after being a professor for years, he was not great about remembering all the names of all of his students. They kind of blended together. And then, at the end of the interview, Phillips thanked James for coming in and said they'd follow up with him if they needed to. After that interview, Phillips was getting frustrated. He had figured that Janet, the person who wrote the love letters to Thera, had to be a classmate or co-worker or at least somebody Thera knew from school. But, so far, the search for Janet had been a total dead end, and the team was still looking into Marion's alibi, so they couldn't rule him out as a suspect. They even decided to bring Marion back in and to keep him at the station until they were sure they knew where he had been on the night of the murder. But Phillips was having doubts that Marion was the killer, and he was almost positive that Thera's secret lover, Janet, had something to do with Thera's death. Later that day, Phillips met with the coroner at the mortuary, and the results of Thera's autopsy threw Phillips for a loop. At the time of her death, Thera had traces of marijuana in her system, but it wasn't from smoking marijuana, which would be the most common way to ingest the drug. Instead, Thera had ingested a very uncommon type of marijuana in powder form. In addition to that, Thera had also ingested something even stranger, blister beetle extract, more commonly called Spanish fly, which was a chemical substance taken from an insect. At the time, some people believed Spanish fly was an aphrodisiac that heightened a person's sexual performance. But Spanish fly was not exactly easy for anyone to just get. So, by that evening, Phillips was starting to feel like this case, which had seemed pretty straightforward at first, was now starting to seem really complicated and just totally weird. And then later that night, the case got even weirder because Phillips got a phone call from a woman who said she was a landlord and that she was sure she had rented a small apartment in the city to the dead girl she'd seen in the newspaper. Phillips hung up the phone with the landlord and just shook his head. In the course of about a day, he discovered Thera's gun, her shocking bank accounts, hurl of letters, and her secret apartment. But he still didn't have the one piece of evidence he badly wanted. He didn't know who this Janet person was. On the same night that Phillips had spoken to that landlord, he and a few other officers drove across town to see the apartment Thera had supposedly rented. Phillips was exhausted and he felt like that day might never end. But he hoped maybe something in this new apartment would either prove Marion was the murderer or lead him to Janet. The landlord walked Phillips and his team into the small one-room apartment. A large brass bed took up most of the space, and there was one wooden chair in the corner. Phillips also saw a back door that would allow people to come in and out of the apartment without being seen by anybody on the street in front. One look at the place and Phillips knew this was a classic love nest where people would meet to have a secret affair. Phillips showed the landlord a photo of Thera, and the landlord said that was definitely the woman who had rented this place, but she used a different name. The landlord also said Thera had told her she would not be renting the apartment anymore and would move her things out that week. Phillips and his team searched the room for any piece of evidence that might help their investigation. But it looks like Thera had already moved out because all they found was a woman's brown hat lying on the hardwood floor. So when Phillips's long day finally ended, he still had Marion in custody at the police station, but he didn't really have anything new to go on. In the days following Detective Phillips's visit to Thera's secret apartment, police were able to corroborate almost all of Marion's alibi for the night of Thera's murder. But there was still about 30 minutes that night that Marion could not account for, and nobody close to him had seen him during that time. 30 minutes was long enough for Marion to have driven Thera out to the field by the shooting range and to have killed her, so Marion remained a prime suspect. Then, even though the investigation into this case had only been going on for a few days, the county prosecutor started to put a lot of pressure on Phillips and his team. The county prosecutor was new. He was young. And so the police figured he just wanted to make a name for himself by bringing a big-time murder case to trial. But the county prosecutor pointed to the continuing stories in the newspapers that were spreading wild rumors about a maniac roaming the streets of Columbus, wanted to hunt down more young women. So the prosecutor said this case needed to be closed soon before there was complete panic across the city. Detective Phillips agreed with that, but Phillips was convinced he wouldn't be able to close the case until he found this Janet person, the person he was sure was having an affair with Thera when she was killed. So Phillips and his team kept interviewing new people connected to Thera, and they circled back around to talk to people they had already met with to see if maybe they had missed something the first time they spoke. Then just after 11, 0 on June 18th. So 5 days after Thera's murder, police brought a woman in who they hoped could move the investigation forward. The young county prosecutor would lead the interview. He asked the woman a series of questions over the course of 4 hours, and when the woman was tired and worn down, she said something that made Phillips and the prosecutor rethink the entire investigation. What they heard in that interview would finally lead Phillips to his Janet, and the police would discover who had killed Thera. Based on the interview led by the county prosecutor of that woman, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the night someone murdered Thera Hicks on June 13, 1929. On that day at about 9 p.m. at night, Janet's blue coupe pulled into the parking lot near the student center on the Ohio State campus. Janet was wearing pants, a dress shirt, and a tie shirt. Janet was nervous and kept glancing back and forth to make sure nobody was watching the car. Then Janet saw Thera walking towards the parking lot. Thera got into the car, gave Janet a kiss, and they sped away from the university. A few minutes later, Thera found herself staring out at fields and farmland as they headed to the shooting range outside of the city. Thera knew this job well, but something felt a little different that night. She felt a little lightheaded and maybe a bit confused. Still, she was excited to be going back to the shooting range. She had avoided it ever since she got caught by the police there over a year earlier, but she figured, with as dark as it was going to be that night, the police wouldn't find them. Janet eased off the gas and turned onto the road that led past the shooting range and parked in the field nearby. Thera looked over at Janet and smiled, but Janet just looked away. Thera's head started to feel even lighter than it had on the drive over, and her face was starting to feel flushed and hot. Then Janet turned to her and said something that made Thera very angry. Thera snapped a comment back, and then, before long, the two were arguing. Thera was livid and she shouted at Janet, and then Janet screamed even louder back. And before long, Thera just felt so lightheaded and so angry that she just wanted to get some air. So Thera grabbed the door handle, but before Thera could get out of the car, Janet leaned into the back seat, picked up a hammer, and smashed it into the back of Thera's head. Thera heard ringing in her ears, but she was still conscious, just totally stunned. The cramped car had not allowed Janet to really get a full swing before she hit Thera. Thera's head wavered back and forth, and she turned and just stared at Janet in stunned silence. And Janet simply raised the hammer again and began striking Thera over and over again in the face. Thera felt warm blood running over her eyes, her cheeks and nose, but she managed somehow to open the car door and she stumbled into the field outside. Janet flung the driver's side door open, rushed around the car, grabbed Thera by the arm. Then Janet raised the hammer high and brought it down again on the back of Thera's head. Thera slumped forward onto the ground. Arm hit the ground hard in front of her, and her watch actually broke. Janet just stood there staring down at Thera as blood began to pool around her, and Thera was still moaning and gasping for air. Janet thought that sound was absolutely horrible, so Janet dropped the hammer, took out a pocket knife, crouched down, and slit Thera's throat. Thera would die in that field. Then Janet grabbed the hammer off the ground, ran to the car, tossed the hammer and knife into the passenger seat next to Thera's purse, and then Janet sped away from the field and back onto the main road. Early the next morning, Janet went to the secret love nest and almost completely cleaned it out. Then Janet drove the blue coupe to the Ohio State campus and got the car washed by the custodian who worked at the university's veterinary school, where Janet was a professor. Dr. James Snook, the Olympic gold medal winner and widely respected veterinarian, was Janet. He had murdered Thera. It would turn out that James and Thera had been having an affair for years, but they had gone to great lengths to keep it secret. And so after Thera had gotten caught fornicating with Marion at the gun range, it really frightened James that they might get caught having their affair. And so, she and James worked even harder from that point on to completely cover their tracks. That's why Thera almost never talked about her personal life. That's why James and Thera had rented an apartment they could sneak into through the back door. And that was why in all of their correspondence, James used a fake name, Janet. Ultimately, Thera wanted James to leave his wife for her, and she would get jealous and angry when he spent time with his family. And so sometimes Thera would go out with Marion just to try to make James jealous. But Thera did always hope that she and James would somehow work out their problems and be happy together. And in the days leading up to the murder, James had said that he did not want them to rent that secret apartment anymore. So Thera thought that meant maybe James was finally going to tell her that he was leaving his wife and that they could bring their relationship out into the open. But James had absolutely no intention of doing that. He was not about to leave his wife. He just wanted to stop renting the apartment with Thera. And he worried that when he told Thera this, she would end up telling his wife everything about their affair. So James decided to kill Thera. It turned out James's gold medal in the Olympics was for pistol shooting, so he was very familiar with the shooting range outside the city, and he would still go and practice there sometimes. He thought the shooting range's reputation as a sort of lover's lane would provide him cover and make it look like the murder was the result of an argument between a young couple about it. On the night of the murder, James was a little bit hesitant, but when he told Thera he was going to be going away for a while with his family, Thera snapped and got really mad. And so James just reached back into the back seat, grabbed the hammer, and followed through with his plan. But James got caught because the woman who spoke to Detective Phillipson, the county prosecutor at the police station, was James's wife. The police had brought her in because they had begun to suspect that Thera was more to James than just someone who could help him with his book, and they wondered if maybe James's wife had killed Thera in a jealous rage. But after hours of being interviewed, James's wife revealed that James had left the house and been gone for a long time on the night of Thera's murder. And so police dug deeper into James's background, and they discovered that James had been taking amounts of money out of his bank account that matched the amounts in Thera's passbooks. They also learned that James had easy access to the powdered marijuana on the Spanish fly that Thera had ingested because, at the time, both of those substances were used in veterinary medicine. But it was never determined if James had drugged Thera or if she had taken the substances willingly. When Phillipson, the county prosecutor, brought James in to be questioned again, he would first admit to being Thera's secret lover, Janet, and then he would ultimately confess to murdering Thera. James was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death in February of 1930, so less than a year after James had killed Thera. He was executed in Ohio in the electric chair. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are not available on this podcast. They are only on YouTube. Boo. Again, the YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. So that's gonna do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 hiking horror stories that are still shrouded in mystery. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Overlook, and it's about a hiking trip that turns into a nightmare. The second story you'll hear is called One Sock, and it's about a Boy Scout who disappears down a well-marked and populated trail. And the third and final story you'll hear is called I'm Looking for You, and it's about a bizarre mystery on a mountain in China that leaves authorities clueless. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please move into the apartment directly above the Amazon Music Follow Buttons apartment, and then make it a habit to sprint on your treadmill every morning at 3:00 a.m. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Overlook. In 2007, Barbara Bollock was a 55-year-old fit, happy, healthy woman living in Montana with her husband of 14 years. In July of that year, her husband's cousin named Donna and Donna's boyfriend named Jim Rawmaker came to stay with them for a couple of days. On the evening of the 17th, Barbara offered to take the couple hiking with her the following morning at her favorite hiking spot, which was this totally unspoiled wilderness area on the border of Idaho. Barbara liked to hike a particular trail that brought her up to the Bear Creek overlook that had this incredible view down to the valley below. The couple happily agreed, but the following morning, Donna was not feeling so good, so she couldn't go on the hiking. But her boyfriend, Jim, was still feeling up for it and said, "I'd still like to go." And so, he and Barbara wound up doing the hike on their own. At 1:30 that afternoon, Barbara's husband got a phone call from a police officer saying his wife was missing. And her husband just couldn't understand that. Barbara hiked in that area all the time and she had been with Jim. So where could she have gone? But the police officer didn't have a great answer and he just told him, "You should come down here and hear Jim's explanation about what happened." When Barbara's husband arrived at the park, he rolled right up next to the officer and Jim. He got out and Jim, who was in total shock, began to explain what happened. He and Barbara had made it up the trail successfully to the Bear Creek overlook. They'd stayed up there for about 30 minutes. They had a picnic and they were enjoying the scenery. And then at the end of it, they packed up and Barbara began walking down the very well-marked trail. And she was about 20 feet ahead of him when he decided to turn around and take one more look at the beautiful view. And he said he was looking at the view for about 40 seconds before he turned back around, and Barbara was gone. And he hadn't heard her call out for help. He hadn't heard her fall. There was no sound of other people. There was no sound of other animals. There was no sound of any struggle whatsoever. It was just complete eerie silence. And as he took a few steps down the trail, he said he started looking around expecting to just see her behind a tree or something, but she was nowhere. And as he walked, he noticed that the ground underneath every step made a lot of noise because there was lots of loose rocks and shale all over the ground. And so he stopped and he's listening really intently to see if he can hear where Barbara's gone, but he doesn't hear anything. And he's thinking, how could she have gotten away from me without me hearing the sound of her footsteps? And then he also began looking around and realized the area they were in, this trail, it was well trafficked in, so it was not very densely forested. You could actually see a pretty good distance in all directions because there was enough space between the trees. And so he's looking around thinking there's almost nowhere to hide. And so Jim started to feel scared and just began walking down the trail, expecting to run into her at any moment. But he didn't, and he kept turning around and looking behind trees and rocks. And he's thinking, this is impossible. I should have seen her. I should see her now. Where could she have possibly gone? And so he made his way all the way down the trail, the whole time turning around and looking for her and yelling for her and yelling for her, but never getting any feedback from her. And he got all the way to the parking lot and he saw her car was still parked in the parking lot. He's looking around the parking lot. She's not out there. And he noticed a crew was working in the road. And he went up to them and he asked if they had seen her or anybody come out of that trail. And they said no. So Jim started to panic. He ran right back up the trail, all the way back up to the Bear Creek overlook, hoping that along the way he would see some indication of where she went. But, again, there was nothing on the trail. He gets up to the overlook, he's looking around, he's yelling for her, nothing. And so, he ran right back down again and he contacted authorities. Over the next 48 hours, a huge search was launched all around this area for Barbara. It included helicopters and huge search teams and highly trained sniffing dogs. But nothing was found. There was no signs of foul play. There was no signs of an animal attack or some sort of abduction. There was nothing. Not even her scent was found, despite the fact that the dog's handlers knew exactly where her last position was, but none of the dogs picked it up, which is highly unusual. It really was like she had vanished into thin air. At first, Jim was obviously a suspect because he was the last person to see Barbara alive, but he never changed his story, despite how far-fetched it seemed. And he was very cooperative and was very quick to offer to take a polygraph test, and so the police ruled him out as a suspect. And shortly after the search started, they shut it down because there was no sign of this woman anywhere. And so, unfortunately, her family had to face the awful reality of getting zero closure. She was just gone and nobody knew what happened. And unfortunately, to this day, we still don't know what happened because no trace of Barbara has ever been found. Our next story is called One Sock. In late August of 2004, Kevin Bardsley and his 12-year-old son, Garrett, went on a father-son Boy Scout camping trip in the Uinta Mountains in northern Utah. Their campsite was situated next to Lake Ubrant inside of the Wasatch National Forest. The lake was actually pretty remote and difficult to access because it was almost completely surrounded by huge mountains. The only side you could get to the lake on was its western side. But the western trail leading to it was very cumbersome because you had to bypass 7 different lakes. And so, by the time Kevin, Garrett, and the rest of the Boy Scouts and their fathers were at the lake, they were at least an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization. Early in the morning on August 20th, Kevin and Garrett woke up. They hopped out of their tents. None of the other campers had woken up yet, and so they decided they would head down to the lake to get some early fishing in. And so they got their gear and they began walking down the very well-defined 150-meter-long trail down to the lake. As they get there, the sun's coming up over the mountains and they're really excited about their day of fishing. And so, as Kevin is preparing a fishing rod for Garrett, Garrett was jumping around on different stones that were poking out of the water. And at some point he tripped and he fell into the water, soaking his shoes and his pants. And so he hopped out of the water and he's kind of laughing at himself. And he told his dad that he didn't care. He'd fish with wet feet and wet pants and he would change them later. And so Kevin laughed and handed his son his fishing rod. And then the two of them began to fish. After a while, when they hadn't caught anything, Garrett said to his dad that, "You know what, Dad, this is actually pretty uncomfortable. I'm gonna go change my pants and my socks." And so Kevin said, "No problem. I'll be here with our gear. I'll see you when you get back." And so Garrett stands up and he starts walking back up the well-defined 150-meter trail back up towards the campsite. And Kevin actually turned around and watched his son disappear into the trees. But he heard the sound of other campers at the campsite, and so knew his son wouldn't be alone for the next couple of minutes. Kevin kept fishing, but periodically would look over his shoulder, expecting to see Garrett come out of the woods again. But he didn't. And after about 20 minutes, Kevin was a little bit concerned, so he picked up his fishing gear and began walking back up the trail towards the camp. When he got there, he saw other Boy Scouts and their fathers just getting up and having a bite to eat. And he's scanning around the campsite and he doesn't see Garrett. And so he goes over to Garrett's tent and he opens it up, and Garrett's not in there, and there's no sign that he's removed any of his wet clothing in there. And so Kevin turns around and he asked one of the fathers, "Hey, have you seen Garrett? He was supposed to be up here a minute ago." And the father said, "No, I haven't seen him." And so Kevin started to panic and he yells out to the group, "Hey, has anyone seen my son? Do you guys know where Garrett went? He was supposed to be up here." And no one knew where he was. They said, "No, we haven't seen him." And so, horrified, Kevin drops all of his gear and starts running back towards the lake, screaming for his son. And the other campers instinctively know what's going on, and so they chase after him, yelling for Garrett. Almost immediately, the sheriff's department was notified, and they launched this huge search that included the FBI. And so, hundreds of people have descended into the area around the lake, and they're looking for Garrett. They can't find him, but later that afternoon, searchers were about a half-mile away from where Garrett was last seen, and they found a single Nike sock that appeared to have been removed from a wet foot, wedged into one of the boulders in this huge boulder field. Garrett's mother would confirm that was Garrett's sock, and so the search effort was shifted to this big boulder field. And for days they looked all over the place for him, but there was no sign of Garrett anywhere. And so, eventually, the search was terminated. The authorities determined this was an accident, that Garrett's father and the other campers had nothing to do with Garrett's disappearance. What their theory is Garrett must have gotten lost on the walk back to the camp and then ultimately died of exposure. But the idea that a boy of Garrett's age would get lost along a well-defined 150-meter-long trail that he was familiar with, that he had been on that day, that seems a little far-fetched. Also, as Garrett was walking down that trail, he would have heard the sounds of the other campers in the campsite, so that would have helped him figure out exactly where he needed to go. He's on a well-marked trail, he's walking towards the sound of the voices, but he never made it to the campsite because no one at the camp saw him, and there was no sign that he had put his wet clothes in his tent. So something happened to Garrett almost immediately when he left his father that caused him to wind up a half-mile away in a boulder field with one sock missing. It's Cream's abduction case. But remember, this campsite was over an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization, and they know this group of Boy Scouts and their fathers were the only ones in the area that day. It is possible that an animal could have taken Garrett, like a mountain lion, but there would have been signs of a struggle and they didn't find any on the trail or anywhere nearby. And you would figure if he was getting dragged off by a big predator, he would have yelled out for help, but he didn't. He just left his dad, it was total silence, and then he vanished. And all we have is his one sock. The next and final story of today's episode is called I'm Looking for You. At 5:00 a.m. on September 30th, 2008, a 61-year-old man named Drent Aizhong finished getting dressed inside of the bedroom that he shared with his wife in the city of Beijing, China. After he finished getting dressed, Shane reached down and scooped up his backpack off the floor that was already packed, and then he carefully walked around his bed trying to be as quiet as possible. And then, as quietly as he could, he kind of tiptoed around the bed to his wife's side to give her a kiss goodbye. Jian was going to be heading out to a local mountain that day for a day hike, and so, he gets next to his wife and he bends down to kiss her, and right as he does that, he accidentally wakes her up. And so his wife opens her eyes and she looks up at him, and Jian just says, I love you. He gives her a kiss and he tells her, hey, I'll be back tonight before midnight. And so his wife, she kind of groggily said, okay, and she grabbed his hand and squeezed it, and she told him that she loved him. And then she fell back asleep, and moments later, Jian had left the bedroom and walked out the front door. Nen's home was only a couple of blocks away from the train station, and since he needed to ride a train and then also a bus to get to this local mountain that was about an hour and a half journey away, the train station was his first stop. And so Jian, as he walked towards the station, he was all smiles. He was really excited about this day. So Ren was retired, but he had spent his whole life teaching geography at Beijing 5 middle school, and he was a very passionate teacher. But the thing he was most passionate about, that he routinely really pushed on his students, in some ways more than geography, was his love of nature. In fact, Ren loved nature so much that when he was not teaching, he basically spent all of his off time out in nature going for hikes. That was his thing. And today, Ren was especially excited about his hike because he was hiking one of his favorite trails. It was located on Mount Miaveng, which is a mountain located 30 miles to the northwest of where Ren lived. And this mountain was quite famous because of all the sacred and ancient temples that kind of dotted the mountain all over the place. And then also, there were all these beautiful roses like the flower that would bloom all over the mountain in the summer. And so, it's just this totally strikingly beautiful place. And normally Ren would actually hike up this trail and then actually camp out on Mount Miaveng, mostly because on the summit, there is this incredible view of downtown Beijing, and at night the view is like spectacular with the city all lit up. But on this particular day, Ren knew an overnight stay was not possible because he had to be back home by the next day, because it was his mother's 90th birthday, and he was very close with his mother and he was not going to miss that. And so Ren eventually made it to the train station, he bought his ticket, he boarded his train, and then he sat down in a seat. And as soon as he did, he opened up his bag and pulled out a stack of papers. For this hike, Ren had packed himself some food and water inside of his backpack. He also packed a newspaper called the Beijing Youth Daily, and he brought along his diary. But his diary was a little bit unique. Ren, because he loved nature so much and didn't like the idea of wasting anything, what he would do when he was a teacher at Beijing 5 middle school, he would just take scrap paper and start writing on that. And he would compile all his scrap paper into these sort of diaries that he would keep. And so Ren passed the time on the train by writing in his diary, his stack of scrap paper, and also reading this newspaper. And Ren knew he really needed to read the entire newspaper pretty quickly, because by the time he got to the mountain, he was going to do what he always did, which is he would bring a newspaper with him on a hike, and as he walked, he would take out a page periodically and tie it to a tree, kind of marking his way. That way, when he turned around and came back down, he would have his path marked, because Ren did not always walk on a clearly marked trail. And so, this was his way of not getting lost. And so Ren would ride the train car, and then he would get off and he would board a bus, and then finally right around 7:00 a.m., that bus would come to a stop in the tiny village of Jianjianfang, which is located right at the base of Mount Mia of Eng. And so Ren grabbed his backpack, he hopped off the bus, and then began walking through the village towards the mountain. And then by about 7 a.m., so not long after Ren had left the bus, he was almost up to Mount Mia of Eng when he pulled out his cell phone and he called his cousin. It was a brief conversation, and all Ren really wanted to do was just to make sure his cousin was going to be around the next day for Ren's mother's birthday. And the cousin said he would, and so Ren told him, "Okay, I'm going hiking today and I will see you tomorrow." And then he hung up. And then only a couple minutes later, Ren disappeared into the beautiful forests of Mount Mia of Eng. So Ren's wife did not expect to hear from Ren at any point that day because she knew he would have terrible cell phone service up on the mountain. But she did expect her husband to be home on time. He had told her that morning before he left that he would be home that night before midnight. And if you knew Ren, you knew this guy was never late. He said, "I'm gonna be someplace at a certain time, he would be there." So when 10:00 p.m. rolled around that night and still Ren was not back yet and he had not called, Ren's wife was actually not worried because she was thinking, okay, well it's 10. Arijo, he'll be home in the next couple of hours because he said he'd be here by midnight tonight, and he will be here tonight. And so, she went to bed expecting to wake up and see Ren in bed with her in the morning. But the next morning, when she woke up, Ren was not in bed, so he did not come home. And so his wife immediately was very concerned and began calling Ren's family, and nobody knew where he was. So that day, the family went to the police and they reported Ren missing. The local police immediately organized a search for Ren. However, they knew this was going to be a very challenging search, and Mount Mia of Eng is not some enormous mountain by any means. It's a decent-sized mountain, but, it's really known for having these paths that twist and turn all over the place, so it's pretty easy to get lost. And then also, there's a whole bunch of sheer cliff faces kind of all over the place, so if you're not paying attention, you could literally just walk off a ledge. So in short, this is a dangerous and confusing place. And at the same time that this search was happening out on the mountain, the police were also in contact with Ren's cell phone service provider to see if they could track down Ren's cell phone. Because obviously, if they could find that, they might find Ren too. But the only way a cell phone can be tracked is if the cell phone is on, because when it's on, it connects to the nearest cell phone, and that's how these service providers are able to tell where these phones are. They look to see which tower it's connected to. But when Ren's cell phone service provider looked for his phone, they quickly determined his phone was off. So, unless the phone came back on again, they would not be able to locate the phone. However, they were able to pull all of Ren's cell phone signal history up until his phone was turned off. And what they found in the signal history is, the day before, so the day Ren went missing, his cell phone was on at 4:00 p.m. that evening, and he received a phone call at 4:00 p.m., and the service provider was able to see that when this phone call came in, Ren's cell phone was not where they thought it would be. It was not high up Mount Mia of Eng. It actually was near the base of the mountain. And when police reached out to the person who had called Ren at 4:00 p.m., they discovered it was just a friend of Ren's. And this friend said that Ren said he was coming down the mountain now and he'd be home soon. So this new information did basically line up with what Ren had told his family he'd be doing that day, just a quick day hike. Although again, they kind of expected it to be a little bit longer. It seemed a little odd he'd be down the mountain by 4:00 p.m. But still, this basically lined up with what they thought he was doing. However, this new information did not help explain what happened to Ren. Like, why was he missing? The expectation was he must have gotten lost or hurt or something up on this mountain, Maybe he's stranded somewhere and can't go anywhere. But now, based on this phone call, it sounded an awful lot like Ren was not even on the mountain when he disappeared. So, where is he? Police had already checked all the bus stations and train stations in the area, to see if maybe Ren took a different way home or something. But when they went to all these different stations, there was no evidence that Ren had been to any of them. And there was another problem. Members of Ren's family told the police about Ren's habit of tying newspapers to trees to mark his trail as he hiked. and the family told the police that Ren did this every single time he hiked. And his wife told the police that for sure, she knew her husband had brought along a copy of that newspaper. So, by all expectations, there should be markers up on that mountain, literally leading searchers to wherever Ren went. But after an entire day of searching Mount Miavang, they didn't find a single newspaper anywhere. For the next several days, this big search for Ren continued, but nothing was found. That is until October 7th, so 1 week after Ren had vanished. On that day, Ren's cell phone service provider noticed that Ren's cell phone had suddenly turned back on. And the phone was not on or near Mount Miavang. Instead, it was located 36 miles away from the mountain at a train station called Beijing West Railway Station. Now, the cell phone was only on for a couple of seconds, but it was on long enough for the provider to confirm that it really was in that location. And so the police immediately dispatched a team to go to Beijing West Railway Station and see if they could find Ren. But when they got there, Ren was not there, his phone was not there. They looked at all the security footage. There was no sign of Ren. They searched the surrounding areas. Nothing. And on this day, at basically the same time that police are at this railway station trying to make sense of, what's going on with the cell phone. A villager from Jianjianfang village, which is that little village that sits at the base of Mount Miavang, came forward with a very strange story. He said on the day that Ren disappeared, this villager was at his little shop. He sold walnuts to hikers that were making their way towards Mount Miavang. It was basically like snacks for the hike, and he sees this guy walking up through the village towards the mountain. And he looked exactly like Ren because now Ren's face was on the news and this villager had seen it. And so he felt like he had seen Ren. And so this villager said, this guy who looked exactly like Ren, he walked up and actually stopped at this villager's shop to buy some walnuts. And this villager and this man who looked like Ren, we just chatted for a few minutes, and at some point this guy who looked like Ren, asked the villager, hey, these are great, but where else can I buy walnuts? I want to buy other types of walnuts and bring them back to my family. And so this villager was like, oh, yeah, well, the best walnuts in all of Beijing are actually located about 30 miles away at the base of another mountain. It's called Taitiou Mountain, and there are vendors over there who sell the best walnuts. So that's your answer right over there. And then after the villager said this guy who looked just like Ren, it's like everything changed for him. It's like his expression changed. His tone changed. It's like he's been given this information that's changed his life, about these walnuts. And he says to the villager, okay, I'm gonna go there right now. And without saying anything else, this man just turned and began quickly walking away from the walnuts, back through town, back towards the bus stop, so away from Mount Miavang. In theory, this guy is going to the bus to what? Commute 30 miles to this other mountain, Taitiou Mountain, to get these walnuts. I mean, the villager does not know this guy, but even he felt like this is bizarre. This guy comes up, he's buying snacks to go hike Mount Miavang. He seems really excited about it. And I offhandedly mentioned these walnuts and he's like, boom, I'm out of here. I'm gonna go 30 miles to this other mountain to get these walnuts. It just seemed weird. And then when police spoke to Ren's family about this new information, they would learn that Ren did not have a special interest in walnuts, and neither did his family. And even if there was a reason why Ren just really wanted these walnuts, he would not have had time in that day to take the bus 30 miles to Taitiou Mountain, get these walnuts, go 30 miles back, and hike up Mount Miavang because he can't stay the night. He needs to come back tonight in order to go to his mother's birthday party the next day. So, it just made no sense. But this walnut thing was basically the only lead police really had because everything else was a dead end. And so they decided to shift their search area from Mount Miavang to Taitiou Mountain. And pretty much right away, they saw something that gave them hope that Ren could be here. They found pages from the Beijing Youth Daily newspaper tied to trees on the mountain. And when they looked more closely at the newspapers, they found the publication date of this newspaper lined up with the copy that Ren would have had with him on the day he vanished. And so, of course, the searchers just began following this trail of newspapers, hoping Ren would be at the other end. For 2 days, searchers very diligently followed this trail up the mountain. It kind of wound around, and they went pretty slowly because they're moving, you know. They're constantly checking everything around. They don't want to miss any clues. But finally, after 2 days of following this trail, they eventually found something. The newspapers led them to a campsite. Now the campsite was abandoned, but there was a bed of hay, there was some used water bottles and some toilet paper. And so just from the looks of it, this campsite looked relatively active, like somebody had been staying here recently for at least a day or two. And so it seemed pretty likely, based on everything else, that this was Ren's campsite. And pretty quickly after searching the campsite, they found something that virtually guaranteed that this was his campsite. Authorities found this plastic bag that was sitting next to the bed, and inside of the bag was a piece of scrap paper from Beijing Nojing 5 middle school, and on the scrap paper was a note. And the note said Ren had indeed hiked up Taitiou mountain on September 30th. This would have been the day that he left. So, the day he disappeared. And then on his way down, he said he got lost and was forced to spend the night out here. And so, that explained the campsite. And then on October 1st, so that would have been the day after he spent the night out here, he said he was going to attempt to follow the ridgeline down the mountain to a nearby village to safety. And this note ended with the phrase, leaving this note here just in case. Love to everyone who passes by. Now at first glance, this note was like amazing news because suddenly it seemed totally possible that Ren was just fine. I mean, the way the note was written, it sounded like he was at least healthy and safe. Albeit I'm sure he was not happy to be stuck up on a mountain. But, you know, he loved being in nature and so he seemed okay. And then he had a reasonable plan for how he was going to get out of there, you know. Follow the ridgeline, go down to a village, go to safety. But as the police analyzed this note, they noticed that some things were off about it. First of all, this note basically directly contradicts other facts of this case. Remember, cell phone records prove Ren got a phone call at 4:00 p.m. on the day he went missing from his friend. And his friend would report that Ren told him that he was coming down Mount Miaveng and he'd be home soon. But according to the note they found, that was not possible because the note said Ren, at 4:00 p.m. on September 30th, the day he went missing, he would have been on Taitiou mountain, either hiking up or being in the process of getting lost in. You know, ultimately making that campsite where he camped out for at least one night. And so, in addition to this factual discrepancy with this note, another issue with the note was just the way it was written. Now Ren's wife had a chance to look at the note and she would say, "That is my husband's handwriting," but the note contained a bunch of very strange language choices that just didn't make sense for Ren to be using. For example, this note, which really should have been a first-person point of view, you know, Ren has gotten lost, he's by himself, he's writing to the world, kind of letting somebody know what's going on with him. And so it really should have been written in the first person. My name is Ren. I am lost. Here's what I'm doing. But the note was written in the third person. Ren got lost on the mountain. And so he is going to camp out for the night. And tomorrow he is going to make his way out to safety. But despite being written in the third person, it did sound like somebody was talking about themselves. It did not feel like somebody else was attempting to document what Ren was doing. But by far, the weirdest part of this note was the tone shift that happened about halfway through. So, the first half of this letter was written, albeit in the third person, but it was grammatically correct and sort of formal, like you would expect from a very well-educated retired teacher. But once you get to that second half of the note, the grammar started being really awkward. And then the very final line, which says love to everyone who passes by, that actually sounds totally awkward in Chinese. So, love to everyone who passes by is the translation into English. And that basically makes sense to us, like that's not an awkward phrase, but if you put it back in Chinese, it's so awkward. It would be like if I tried to say to you, I take the bus to work, but instead I said, to work take bus, right? Like I wouldn't say it that way. And it would immediately seem very awkward for anybody who knows me if I wrote or said something like that. And so, this last line stood out so much that actually police and friends and family of Ren assumed he must have left that in there as like a secret message or a code, like a distress signal, especially when you consider the other weird factors around this note. But nobody could figure out what it meant. The day after this note was discovered, a searcher was up in the vicinity of Ren's campsite on Tai Tou Mountain, and they were walking around kind of retracing their footsteps, looking for new places to search. When they turned the corner and up ahead, they noticed there was this tree kind of hanging out over this rocky cliff. And dangling from the tree was something gray that looked sort of out of place. And so the searcher, sensing this could be a clue of Ren's whereabouts, he yelled out for other searchers in the area that he had found something, and then he took off running towards this thing to see what it was. And when he got up to the tree, he looked up and he saw it was a pair of sweatpants that had clearly been intentionally tied to this branch in the tree. And so the searcher, he reached up and grabbed one of the pant legs and kind of tugged on it. And when he did, all these white things began falling out of the pants and landing on the ground. And when the searcher stopped and looked down to see what they were, he couldn't believe it. It was a whole pile of human bones. However, they were not Ren's. In fact, nobody ever figured out who these bones belonged to or why they were stuffed inside of pants and tied to a tree on this mountain. But the discovery of these bones would open up a whole new mystery. Because after these bones were found, all the searchers came over and basically just began combing the area near these bones. And the police began uncovering body after body after body after body after body. They found 2 more sets of human bones stuffed into pants and tied to trees. And they found the other bodies at the foot of a cliff and also inside of this well and inside of this cave. And so in total, authorities found 10 sets of human remains in the vicinity near Ren's campsite. But none of the human remains belonged to Ren. Officials were only able to identify a few of the bodies, and they were not able to figure out how they died or whether or not foul play was involved. But the discovery of those bodies did mean one thing for Ren's case. It meant, all these people had previously gone up to Tai Tou Mountain before Ren went up and vanished. And when these other people went up the mountain, clearly something horrible happened to them, and we don't know what it is. Is there a killer on the loose? Is there some animal or creature out there that's taking people out? We don't know. But what started to happen since Ren went missing and the story was all over the news in China is that all these other hikers who've been on Tai Tou Mountain before have begun sharing their experiences when they hiked up Tai Tou Mountain. And some of their stories about what they've seen on that mountain are horrifying. One person said they were walking up the mountain, they had their partner with them who was a little bit farther back the trail, and so they're kind of walking up on their own. And the first person, as they're walking up the trail, suddenly sees this guy just kind of come out of nowhere wielding an axe. And he walks up to this person and all he says is, "Are you alone?" And the hiker's like, "No, my partner's back there. They're coming up here. What's going on?" But the Axeman, he basically acted like he didn't even hear their answer, and he just asked it again, "Are you alone?" And the hiker was like, "No, my partner's back there, Earl." And the Axeman again just said, "Are you alone? Are you alone? Are you alone?" And this axe person kept doing that until the hiker and their partner just turned and ran. And then another hiker shared a story about how they were walking up a trail on Tai Tou Mountain. And at some point they lifted their head up and he saw a little ways up the trail, kind of off the trail. So in the tree line were all these people, like this group of strangers, just standing there motionless, kind of half behind trees, like they were kind of trying to hide themselves, but also not to be murdered. And they were just staring at this hiker, unmoving, not speaking, just staring. And so the hiker, they look up and they see this and they were so unnerved so quickly that they just turned and left. And they have no idea who those people were. And so obviously, we have no way of verifying these other hiker stories about what they saw on Tai Tou Mountain. But when you combine their testimony with Ren's story, it really makes you wonder what's going on up there. The official search for Ren was called off at the end of October, so roughly 1 month after he vanished. But unofficially, the search for Ren continues to this day. However, they still have not found his body and basically no real progress has been made. A quick note about our stories, they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved. And some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen Podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Next Bo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's gonna do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.